In BIO202's mad rush through an embarrassingly abbreviated list of animal phyla, most taxa, especially the invertebrates, get shortchanged. In today's lab, we'll be putting just a small bit of enrichment onto at least the mollusks, which is one of my favorite groups of invertebrates. Maybe this is because they're just tasty, but they're interesting as well. Forgive me, but this lab comes with a fairly lengthy introductory lesson. I think there's something like a dozen or more taxonomic classes of mollusks. They are diverse in that way, although most of these classes are pretty obscure, little marine things that you wouldn't likely find in any habitat that's within the reach of most people. The chitin, shown here, is the exception. You can find them in local tide pools, and they're in the class Polyplecophora. But the vast majority of mollusks that you're likely to encounter will be in one of the three big classes: Bivalvia, clams, oysters, and mussels; Gastropoda, snails and slugs; and Cephalopoda, squids and octopuses. By the way, octopuses is right. Octopi is wrong. Why? It's because octopus is not a second declension Latin noun like cactus or fungus. If it were, then you'd be correct to turn the us at the end into an I to make the plural as you do for cacti or fungi. Octopus is instead a Greek word, octo for eight and pus for foot. In Greek, the plural of pus is podes. So technically the proper plural of octopus is in fact octopodes. But unless you're at an excessive level of nerdiness, even for biologists, you'll probably be saying octopuses and not octopodes. Anyways, apart from the Latin and Greek grammar lessons, there are other important issues to know about mollusks, like the way their bodies are comprised of two salient body parts, a foot and a mantle. The foot is usually what we might call the main part of the body. Think of a snail. The foot part has the head with its little horns, the tail, but mostly it's the long belly that the snail glides along as it slimes its way through my garden. The mantle is like an appendage coming off the snail's back, creating a little shroud or snuggie of living tissue that wraps over the foot. In the case of a snail, the mantle secretes a shell. But in a slug, the mantle sits over the foot like a trim little waistcoat, as seen in this banana slug. The term gastropod means stomach foot for the way that the foot is mostly the belly that the animal crawls upon. On a clam, the shell secreted by the mantle is hinged on top with two equal but mirror image shells, produced as the right and left shells, or valves, hence the term bivalve. The foot is the clam's digging tool used to pull itself through sediments on the bottom of the sea or lake. The other name for bivalves is pelicipoda, which means hatchet foot for the general shape of the clam's digging tool. On a squid, the mantle is usually the largest part of the animal, a muscular tube used to pressurize water for the squid's jet-propulsive way of swimming. The foot is really just the head, including a couple of large eyes and a mouth surrounded by tentacles that the animal uses to capture its prey. The cephalo in cephalopod means head, and very aptly, given that there's not much else besides the head in the foot of a typical squid's body plan. When you think about the range of ecologies covered by these three classes of mollusks, it's pretty mind-boggling how diverse this group actually is. Bivalves are primarily filter feeders, capturing bits of organic dreck suspended in the water that circulates into the mantle cavity. Gastropods are largely grazing herbivores, the cows of the invertebrate world. And cephalopods are active raptorial predators, stalking, attacking, and overpowering their prey. Thinking about mollusks in these terms, it might not be evident that they have anything to do with each other, and yet they're united by the common body plan of foot and mantle. Given this body plan, foot, mantle, there's also the space in between the mantle and the foot. This is the mantle cavity, and it puts into play another aspect of molluscan biology that makes them particularly nice for a quick and not too dirty dissection activity. The phylum Mollusca stands out in part by the way that among all animals with relatively large and complex bodies, they are the ones that have practically no coelomic space to speak of. As you may remember from the lecture, the coelom does two things for animals. It lets them grow larger by accommodating internal organs that permit the large area interfaces to meet the animal's need to exchange materials, such as gases, wastes, and nutrients with the outside world. Also, it gives animals without endoskeletons or exoskeletons something for the muscles to act on, a fixed volume of non-compressible fluid that can be pressurized to move parts of the body around. Well, mollusks don't have the same dependence on a coelomic space because they have a mantle cavity to accommodate their internal organs, which really aren't internal at all if they're in the mantle cavity rather than the coelom. This means that we can peek into the mantle cavity of a living mussel without actually cutting open the body of the animal. It would be like if you had your heart, liver, and lungs and kidneys outside of your body, but underneath an overcoat. And so we could just open the coat to see your working organs. Now a little phylogenetics. The three big classes of mollusks split off from each other early in the Paleozoic. Recall that if Kimberella, shown here, is in fact a mollusk, the phylum Mollusca is the only bilaterian phylum that's represented from the Ediacaran. And then, by the time the Ordovician rolls around, the bivalves, gastropods, and cephalopods are all well established as distinct lineages. Of the three, gastropods and cephalopods are sister taxa, while bivalves are basal, although there are even more basal classes of mollusks, including that chitin we saw earlier. So it's during the Cambrian period where an ancestral, most recent common ancestor to all mollusks split off into its many lineages, giving rise to 12 modern mollusk classes, of which we'll just be talking about the big three. Gastropods and cephalopods make for sensible sister taxa because of the way that both have similar shells that are typically spiral shaped. I know you know that not all gastropods have shells. Think about slugs, but snails totally do have coiled shells. To understand slugs, and this would include distinctly non-slug-like things like this sea angel, as shellless derived forms of ancestrally shelled gastropods should not be too hard. Natural selection can certainly favor the loss of a character, here the shell, if it becomes not so useful or even a burden. Most modern cephalopods like squid and octopuses don't have shells, but they too derive from shell-bearing ancestors. Mostly, cephalopods had coiled shells, although there was a lot of variation in shape. One difference between gastropod shells and pretty much all other shelled mollusks is the way that gastropods have this feature called spire, in which spiraling is not all in a single plane. Whether gastropod or cephalopod, the animal lives in just the largest and outermost chamber of the shell. The next chamber behind the current chamber is smaller, and the one after that is smaller still. And by tracing backwards in time, you go through smaller and smaller chambers until you get to the animal's very first, very tiny shell. In order to grow, the animal must make another larger chamber to accommodate its larger body size, and this will become the next part of the spiral. In the case of a non-gastropod, like this ammonite, which is a cephalopod, all of the chambers are in the same plane, forming a shape more or less like a cinnamon bun. Shelled gastropods, it turns out, are actually quite weird. They have a fundamental asymmetry in which one gill is lost and then the whole body twists around in one direction. This also causes the shell to tweak off of the spiral's plane. Instead of being a flat cinnamon bun, it takes the shape of a pointy turban. or serving of Mr. Whippy, or a poo emoji. I know this sounds totally trivial, but now you can use this characteristic of shell spire to determine at a glance whether any fossil shell you come across belongs to a gastropod or not. And if it's a spiral shell that's not a gastropod, because it's shaped like a cinnamon bun, then it's almost certainly going to be a cephalopod. I'm going to include 4 taxa of cephalopods in our tree for lab. The most basal is the lineage of nautiloids, the Nautiloidea. Can anyone guess the living animal still around from this lineage? Yeah, the chambered nautilus. We may or may not see one of these if we make it to the Birch Aquarium in 2 weeks. The second branch in our tree, still basal but not as basal as the nautiloids, is the Ammonoidea. This is the one that includes the ammonites, super important marine predators from the Devonian and through the Mesozoic, but going extinct when the Chicxulub bolite smashed into Mexico. The fossils are quite abundant because the shells of most ammonites are quite heavy. Just the kind of thing that fossilizes nicely. I went to this museum in Japan that practically specialized in ammonites. There was a whole room full of them, including supermassive shells that got up to over 1 meter in diameter. The crown lineage of cephalopods is the Coleoidea, and this includes 2 major divisions, the Octopodiformes and the Decapodiformes. I'll leave it to you to figure out what is different between these 2 lineages. In the first dissection of today's lab, we're going to be dissecting a California market squid, Doryteuthis opalescens. For those of you who are eventually going to be rubbing elbows with marine biologists, you should know that most of them will know and refer to this animal as Loligo opalescens, which has been the Latin name for our local inshore squid until only fairly recently. And even there, this new name given to our squid by the Grand Council of Cephalopod Officialdom isn't yet recognized by our local fish and wildlife departments, who still refer to this squid as Loligo, which is the genus of squid described first by Lamarck. Yes, that guy we talked about back in the early days of the semester. They reclassified our local squid to the closely related genus Doryteuthis when it became clear from molecular data that this was the right thing to do. So, it would be great if you had your own specimen of a fresh Doryteuthis opalescens to do a dissect along with the next video. If you have access to an Asian market, or even a good seafood market, you can get 1 or 2 of these guys fresh or frozen defrosted for under $1. You want whole, that is, uncleaned squid of a quality suitable for cooking and eating yourself. But honestly, much of the frozen squid that's sold in bait stores is just as good. We usually just defrost a tray of bait squid to supply our labs. Now, if you can't get a squid to work on, you can continue on with the next video and participate virtually without getting your hands smelly, but also without the complete experience.